Welcome to a ruined chapel by moonlight. I'm your host, Bertold Gambro. And today I'm reviewing The Unpublishables by Noah Goetz. The first thing to know about The Unpublishables is that when you open it in the Kindle reader, you need to make sure and scroll back to see the epigraph. At least for me, Kindle wants to launch right into Chapter 1 without showing this important front matter. You don't want to miss this epigraph. It really sets the tone. Now then. The Unpublishables is narrated by a man named Daniel, who is the only person in America immune to a virus sweeping the country. This virus attacks the mind and causes its victims to become obsessed with writing novels. Everywhere Daniel goes, people ask him, "What's your novel about?" He gradually learns that the best way of deflecting this question is to ask them about theirs, which of course they're only too happy to tell him about. But one day, Daniel meets a young woman named Abigail at lunch, and the two of them instantly connect over their shared love of books, reading them rather than writing them. In a desperate effort to impress Abigail, and if nothing else, have a reason to talk to her again despite her pretentious, arrogant boyfriend, Chadwick, Daniel realizes he must write a novel. On the spur of the moment, he chooses life among the homeless of San Francisco as his subject. The best way to write about the homeless, Daniel soon decides, is to become one of them. And so he becomes a vagrant, living with nothing but the clothes on his back and begging for food and money. And in doing so, he encounters a wide variety of strange characters, from a woman who resembles a witch to a sinister figure known simply as the Knife Man, who has a penchant for telling gruesome historical stories with a curious sci-fi twist. The Unpublishables is, of course, a comic novel, and as in his previous efforts, Goetz shows first-rate skill at writing lines that make you laugh out loud. Early dialogues are Woodhouseian in more ways than one. The descriptions are vivid and memorable. And the books. Oh, the books! The way he writes about books is beautiful. I'll talk more about this later, but if you're in a hurry and have to make a purchase decision by the end of this paragraph, know that you can buy the Unpublishables for the descriptions of books alone, and you'll be a happy customer. And although it's mainly comic, The Unpublishables has some emotionally powerful moments that are not played for laughs. Some of the passages about the homeless are truly moving. In particular, one section where Daniel ponders why so many homeless people talk to themselves. It's a moment of genuine compassion and empathy, as well as being a really surprising idea that I had never considered before. But you'll have to read the book to see what I mean. The descriptions of life on the street are properly gritty. Goetz is never afraid to go into detail to describe every facet of what it means to live without money, food, or shelter, no matter how unpleasant it may be. It's raw and tough to read at times, but the grit balances the wit, and it makes the whole thing feel real instead of just a simple comedic puppet show. Does Daniel succeed in his quest to write a novel and win Abigail away from her obnoxious partner? Well, I wouldn't dream of spoiling that. This book is hot off the presses, figuratively speaking, it's on Kindle, and hardly anyone has had a chance to write about it yet. I know I typically spoil things with appropriate warnings, but in this case I'm just not going to talk about the ending. It's one thing to spoil a Hollywood film or a novel by a famous author. When I do that, I know that there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of spoiler-free reviews out there that people could read instead. But as of this writing, if you want to read about The Unpublishables, you pretty much have to read this review. In fact, well, never mind. I'll come back to that. The book is, by the author's own admission, a bit weird. If you've read this blog before, you know that weird is not considered a bad thing here. In fact, as often as not, it's a compliment. So yes, the book is decidedly weird, but in all the right ways. Also, there are a handful of typos, but way fewer than in many indie books, and their existence is even lampshaded by the narrator, who asks us to pretend they are stylistic choices and not simply the result of him being a sloppy writer. This is one of the things I love about the Daniel character. He's a bit of an unreliable narrator, but he tells you so up front. This sums him up pretty well. Oh, and one other technical note. There's a formatting issue in the form of a completely blank page between two chapters. This might be a result of reading in landscape mode, which seems to do odd things to the e-reader. Alright, now let's get to the heart of things. I promised on Twitter that I was going to break one of my own rules of writing reviews. What did I mean by that? Once in a while, when you read about fiction, you'll see something referred to as significant or important. For instance, Wikipedia informs us that James Joyce's Ulysses is one of the most important works of modernist literature. Anytime I see words like important or significant used in regards to fiction, it sends up a major red flag. Why, I ask, are people describing this thing as important when the word good is shorter to write and easier to say? If somebody wants me to read a book, they had better tell me it's good. And if instead they come and tell me, read this book, it's important. It seems to me like they are hiding something. They may be trying to induce me to read a book that is not good for some nefarious reason. Thus, I try never to say something is important when good will do just as well. But that isn't to say that a book can't be both important and good. In my opinion, To Kill a Mockingbird is both important, due to its relationship to the civil rights movement in the United States, and also just generally good as a story that is enjoyable to read. In my opinion, if it had been bad, it would never have been widely read enough to become important. So first and foremost, I want to make it very clear that The Unpublishables is a good book. It's a fun story with memorable characters and witty descriptions. It's really all a book needs to be good, in my opinion. But I also feel that it is an important book as well, and not because of its depiction of homelessness, even though that is another very strong element of the novel. As I said above, throughout his travels, Daniel meets all kinds of odd characters, all of whom have written or are writing a book. Each of them is an example of some aspect of indie publishing. The Unpublishables is a fine title, but the book might as easily have been called The People You Meet in Indie Publishing, because so many different quirks of the world of independent writers are covered, from ham-fisted author insertion to blatant plagiarism. At one point, Daniel comments that more people are writing books than have read one. Daniel finds fragments of manuscripts of historical fiction, hears summaries of wild science fiction and fantasy adventures, and meets shameless self-promoters. Some of the aspiring writers he meets are ground into despair after all the rejections, while others are still brimming with optimism. One of them even hides his own novel in the shelves at a used bookstore in the hopes someone will find it and read it. The book pokes a lot of fun at indie authors, and at times Daniel makes some biting commentaries about the whole process of writing and publishing. I was quite amused by it, and at the same time, as Jack Point from The Yeoman of the Guard would say, my laughter had an echo that was grim. Because, like the targets of Point's jokes, I recognized a little of myself in the figure being roasted. Now, you might say, how could he make fun of indie authors? What a rotten thing to do, kicking a person when they're down like that. Well, that's the thing. Goats isn't laughing at us. He's laughing at himself, obviously, because he's an indie author too. And it is so abundantly clear that all of the jokes in this book are born of affection rather than malice that it's impossible to be offended by them. Paul Graham once wrote that to have a sense of humor is to be strong. The humor of The Unpublishables is the humor of strength, the humor that comes from people who can laugh at themselves because, to be blunt, they know they're doing something important. After all, Goetz wrote a whole book that made fun of the process of writing books. One assumes he must have really believed in what he was doing to essentially be half laughing at himself while doing it. And that's what I mean when I say The Unpublishables is an important book. It's important to the indie author community, to us. I say us because I am an indie author, and I know that nearly everyone who reads this blog is as well. The appreciation Daniel, and by extension Goetz, has for books is evident throughout The Unpublishables, both books in physical form and as a medium for telling stories, for capturing some part of a person's life. Underlying all the friendly ribbing about the oddities of the indie author world is a deep love for the written word. Plenty of all-time great authors and books are referenced throughout, and indeed one of them is used as the catalyst for bringing the hero and the heroine together at the beginning. That's what I ultimately got out of The Unpublishables. At its core, it's about the power of books, reading them, discussing them, and writing them, to bring people together, to let people share a bit of themselves with someone else. A book is a hard thing to create, but when it is done out of love, something magical happens. And this is where you come in. Again, I know most of you reading this are indie authors, and many of you have blogs of your own. I highly encourage you to read this book and to write about it. Partially, I'm doing this for selfish reasons. There are things in here I want to talk about with other people, including some alternate interpretations of certain elements, as well as how different parts all tie into the theme. But it's hard to talk about that when I don't know anyone else who has read the book. But apart from my own self interested reasons, I think this book is important for indie authors because it's by an indie author and it's about an indie author. And in some sense, it tells the story of all indie authors.